She tried not to stare. Everything she had ever been taught, every warning from her superiors, every fear that had kept her alive for months, screamed at her to look away. But she couldn't. The sight of the British soldier standing just outside the tent filled her with an unsettling mix of fear and curiosity. Corporal James Bennett, clad in his army uniform, appeared almost ghostly against the backdrop of the bleak winter landscape. The frigid air clung to her skin like a shroud, amplifying the tension as she sat on the rough wooden bench inside the barracks, her heart pounding in her chest. A bitter wind howled outside, swirling the snowflakes into disarray, while inside, the atmosphere was thick with apprehension. Anneliese Müller, a young German prisoner of war, shifted uncomfortably, the coarse fabric of her uniform scratching against her skin. The makeshift barrack, a faded canvas structure, smelled of damp earth and unwashed bodies, a constant reminder of the grim reality that enveloped her. She could hear the distant echoes of her fellow prisoners, their muted conversations filled with the weight of despair and uncertainty. This single moment would redefine her entire world. Before we uncover why, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. It's amazing to see how far these stories travel. Now back to 1945. The winter of 1945 was a harsh and unforgiving time, particularly in the northern stretches of France, where the bitter chill seeped into the bones of the weary. The war had raged on for years, and the scars it left were etched deeply into the landscape and the hearts of those caught in its relentless grip. The prisoners of war like Anneliese were remnants of a conflict that had spiraled out of control, trapped in a world that had turned their lives upside down. Anneliese had grown up in the shadow of Nazi propaganda, instilled with a sense of duty and superiority that had been woven into her very being. The images of the enemy were painted in shades of black and white, brutal, heartless beings who threatened the very fabric of her homeland. Yet, as she sat in that tent, observing the soldier who had unknowingly captured her attention, a flicker of doubt began to unravel the fabric of her beliefs. Her mind raced back to her childhood, where laughter and innocence had once thrived. Memories flooded her thoughts, the warmth of her mother's embrace, the echo of her father's voice as he spoke of honor and bravery. But those memories were tainted by the harsh realities of war, distorted by the dark lens through which she had been taught to view the world. She had been conditioned to see only monsters where there were people, and yet here was Corporal Bennett, his expression softening as he spoke to the other prisoners. Anneliese's heart ached as she remembered the last time she had felt joy. It was a fleeting moment, lost in the chaos of her life. The barracks were filled with whispers of despair, and she could sense the shared trauma of those around her. Colleagues turned friends, now mere shadows of their former selves, haunted by the loss of their homes and families. The palpable tension in the air only heightened her internal conflict. Here she was, a soldier's daughter, a product of a regime that had painted the world in broad strokes of hatred and fear, now trapped in a reality that contradicted everything she had been taught. The arrival of new guards had stirred apprehension among the prisoners. Rumors swirled like the snowflakes outside. Would they be kinder or more ruthless? Anneliese found herself on edge, her pulse quickening at every sound. She had spent weeks in this camp, her body and mind worn down by the relentless cold and uncertainty. Each day blurred into the next, and the lines between friend and foe became increasingly indistinct. As she sat in the dim light of the tent, she felt the weight of her upbringing pressing down on her. The teachings of her youth echoed in her mind, warnings of the enemy that should never be trusted. Yet the soldier outside, with his slightly crooked grin and the way he interacted with the others, there was something undeniably human about him. The dissonance in her thoughts was palpable. How could the enemy be so approachable? With a heavy heart, Anneliese wrestled with her emotions. The world outside was painted in fear and animosity, yet here in this moment, she was confronted with a truth that felt irreconcilable. Her eyes darted back to James, who was now laughing with another soldier, their voices carrying through the thin walls. The sound stirred something inside her, a longing for connection, for understanding that she had buried deep within. As the minutes ticked by, Anneliese felt the hesitation gnawing at her insides. She wanted to look away, to retreat into the safety of her own beliefs, but she couldn't. She was drawn to the laughter, to the humanity that seemed to emanate from the British soldier like a beacon in the darkness. The tension in the air was suffocating, yet it was also a promise, a hint of something more profound than the hatred she had been taught to embrace. In that moment, as the wind howled and the shadows danced around her, Annalise found herself at a crossroads. Could she allow herself to see the soldier not as an enemy, but as a person? The question lingered in the air, heavy with the weight of her upbringing and the flickering hope for a different reality. The walls of her conditioning began to crack, and in that fragile space, the possibility of understanding flickered like a candle in the dark. As Annalise wrestled with her thoughts, the scene outside the tent unfolded with a strange sense of inevitability. The cold, hard world of war closed in around her, but within her a spark of curiosity ignited, a whisper that perhaps, just perhaps, there was more to the story than she had ever known. The biting cold of the winter air seeped through the thin fabric of the tent, wrapping around Annalise like a relentless predator. She could hear the muffled sounds of distant artillery. The thud of shells exploding in the far-off fields created a haunting rhythm that echoed in her mind. The noise was a constant reminder of the war raging beyond the confines of this makeshift prison, where she and her fellow captives were held in a fragile limbo between life and death. Annalise's heart raced as she focused on the soldier outside. His warm laughter seemed so out of place amidst the harshness of their surroundings, each chuckle reverberating against the stark canvas walls. She felt a strange pull, a desire to understand this man who embodied everything she had been taught to fear. Yet, the years of indoctrination, the slogans drilled into her from an early age, fought fiercely against this burgeoning curiosity. In her mind, she recalled the propaganda posters that plastered the walls of her childhood home. The images of men in British uniforms depicted as monsters, their faces contorted into cruel sneers. They were the enemy, the ones who sought to destroy everything she held dear. But here, standing before her, was a human being. His eyes sparkled with a warmth that seemed to defy all she had ever learned. As she fought against the urge to look, memories flooded back, a collage of her upbringing. She saw her mother, a stern woman whose voice rang with pride as she spoke of the fatherland, instilling in Annalise a sense of superiority over those deemed inferior. Her father had fought valiantly, or so she was told, against the very soldiers she now found herself observing. The conflict within her was a cacophony of fear and confusion, each thought wrestling for dominance. Just then, a voice broke through her reverie. "Oi, you lot! Come on, get in line!" It was a guard, barking orders as he ushered the prisoners towards the central area of the camp. Annalise's heart sank as she knew what was coming. Rations, meager as they were, would be distributed. The thought of food made her stomach ache, though the idea of facing the soldiers brought with it a wave of dread. "Stay close," she whispered to her friend Greta, who had been seated beside her in the tent. Greta nodded, her eyes wide with apprehension, mirroring Annalise's own feelings. The two women shuffled forward, their movements slow and hesitant, like frightened animals approaching a predator. As they stepped into the bitter cold, Annalise's gaze darted towards Corporal Bennett. He was now standing with a few other soldiers, their bodies silhouetted against the pale winter sun. She noticed the way he interacted with his comrades, laughter spilling forth like sunlight breaking through dark clouds. There was something unguarded about him that both intrigued and terrified her. "Do you think they'll be kinder than the last batch of guards?" Greta asked, her voice barely a whisper. Annalise shrugged, the weight of uncertainty growing heavier on her shoulders. She wanted to believe that perhaps these men were different, that they might see her and the others as fellow human beings rather than mere enemies. As they reached the distribution point, Annalise caught sight of a small pile of rations being handed out. The sight of the scant food stirred a pang of desperation within her. Each soldier took turns passing out the rations, their faces a mix of indifference and, surprisingly, moments of compassion as they interacted with the women before them. Then it happened. James stepped forward, his expression softening as he approached Annalise. "Here you go," he said, his voice warm and inviting as he extended a small tin filled with what could only be described as a questionable stew. "I'd offer you something better, but this is all we have for now." She hesitated, her heart pounding. This was the moment she had dreaded and anticipated all at once. The tin seemed to shimmer in his hand, a lifeline in a sea of despair. She could feel the weight of his gaze, searching for something in her eyes, perhaps a flicker of trust or a hint of acceptance. Yet, all she felt was fear. In that moment, as she reached out to take the tin, James made a light-hearted remark that broke through the tension that hung in the air. "I promise it's not as bad as it looks. The rats even have a taste for it." His laughter rang out, a genuine sound that filled the space between them, stirring something deep within her. For the first time, Annalisa found herself smiling, unable to suppress the reaction even as the guilt washed over her. This couldn't be right. He was supposed to be the enemy, yet here he was, making her laugh. "I suppose I'll have to take your word for it," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The moment stretched between them, a fragile thread connecting their two worlds. She saw the surprise flicker in his eyes, quickly replaced by a soft understanding. In that instant, the facade of enmity began to crack, allowing a sliver of humanity to seep through. Annalisa turned her gaze away, the weight of the moment heavy in her chest. The laughter that had momentarily bridged the chasm between them now felt like a betrayal of everything she had known. She felt the warmth of embarrassment creeping up her cheeks, battling against the cold of the winter air. As she stepped back from James, the reality of her situation closed in around her like a vice. She was still a prisoner, still trapped in a war that had stripped away her sense of self. The rations she held felt heavier than before, a reminder of her new reality. James's laughter echoed in her mind, a haunting melody that would not fade. Before she could process her feelings, Greta nudged her gently, pulling her back to the present. "What's wrong? You looked happy," she whispered, concern etching her features. Annalise shook her head, trying to dismiss the confusion swirling within her. "I don't know," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. It's complicated." "Complicated? What do you mean?" Greta pressed, her curiosity piqued. Annalisa hesitated. How could she explain the feelings that churned within her? The laughter had felt like a glimmer of hope, yet it also threatened to unravel the very fabric of her beliefs. I thought they were different. I thought they were monsters," she confessed, her voice barely above a breath. Greta's brow furrowed in confusion. "But they are, aren't they? They're the enemy." "Are they?" Annalise countered, the question hanging heavy in the air. The weight of her words settled between them, the implications lingering like smoke from a long-extinguished fire. The two women stood in silence, the laughter of the soldiers fading into the background. All around them, the world continued to move. The guards shouted. The rations were handed out, and the distant sound of gunfire reminded them of the war that remained ever present. Annalisa felt a strange sense of isolation wash over her. She had shared a moment of humanity with a soldier she was meant to despise, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she had betrayed herself in the process. Perhaps she was not the only one in this camp who had been ensnared by the tangled web of war and ideology. Before she could dwell on her thoughts, the guard's voice rang out, jolting her back to the present. "Move it," he barked, his tone harsh as he gestured for them to continue. Annalise stepped forward, her heart heavy with uncertainty. She was caught in a tumultuous sea of emotions, oscillating between the warmth of connection and the cold grip of fear. As they returned to the confines of their tent, Annalisa felt an overwhelming urge to reassess everything she had ever believed. The walls of the camp felt more constrictive than ever, and she longed for the freedom to explore this new perspective, to understand the humanity behind the uniforms that had once seemed so terrifying. Before we dive deeper into Annalise's story, let us know in the comments your thoughts on how war changes perspectives. Now, back to the war-torn winter of 1945. Annalise sat on the rough wooden bench, her fingers trembling as they clutched the frayed hem of her worn dress. The fabric felt thin against the sharp, biting cold that seeped through the tent walls, but it was nothing compared to the chill that ran through her spine at the sight of Corporal James Bennett. The soldier, with his tousled brown hair and kind eyes, stood at the entrance, silhouetted against the grey light of a winter's day. She tried to hide her smile, but it was a futile effort. The warmth in his gaze was disarming, a dangerous distraction from the harsh reality of her situation. Everything she had learned about the enemy, every bit of propaganda that had been drilled into her since childhood, screamed at her to look away, to uphold the barriers that had been erected between them. But she couldn't. The air was thick with tension, a palpable mixture of fear, anxiety, and the biting cold that had become a constant companion in the camp. Outside, the sound of distant artillery echoed, a grim reminder that the war was still raging on, even if this moment felt suspended in time. Annalise's heart raced as she watched James step inside, his boots crunching on the snow that had been carried in on his uniform. He moved with a casual ease, a stark contrast to the sharp rigidity of the guards. There was something inherently human about him, something that made her wonder if the stories she had been told were true. Was he really a monster, as she had been taught to believe, or was he, like her, simply a product of his environment? "Good afternoon, ladies," James greeted the other prisoners with an easy smile, his accent lilting, disarming. He didn't speak with the harshness she had expected. Instead, his voice was warm and friendly, a stark contrast to the coldness of the steel bars and barbed wire that surrounded them. Annalise's breath caught in her throat. She had seen men like him before, but they had always been shrouded in the shadows of gunfire and chaos. This man was different. He was here to bring food, not to take lives. He approached her table, holding out a small tin canister. "I've got some rations here. It's not much, but it's better than what they've been serving." His voice was light, almost teasing, as if he were sharing a secret. Annalise's stomach growled at the mention of food, but her instinct urged her to refuse. "Why are you helping us?" she asked, the defiance in her voice masking the hunger that gnawed at her core. James raised an eyebrow, his expression shifting to one of genuine surprise. "Because we are all human. I can't stand by and watch anyone suffer when I can do something about it," he replied, his tone earnest. The tin canister glinted in the dim light, a beacon of hope amidst the drab surroundings. As he leaned closer, she caught the faint scent of soap and something sweet, a stark contrast to the pervasive odor of sweat and despair that filled the camp. Her reasons for mistrust battled against an overwhelming urge for sustenance. "Take it," he urged gently, his eyes holding hers, deep and sincere. "You look like you could use it." A battle raged within her. Years of indoctrination clashed with the reality of her present. She knew she should refuse, that accepting anything from him meant acknowledging his humanity and, in turn, her own. But the gnawing emptiness in her belly overpowered her reservations. Tentatively, she reached for the canister, her fingers brushing against his. The warmth of his hand sent a shiver up her arm, a reminder that he was not a monster. He was a person just like her. The moment their fingers touched, time seemed to stretch into eternity. She saw the kindness in his eyes, a reflection of something she hadn't felt in a long time: compassion. And then, unexpectedly, he broke the tension with a laugh. "I swear the food here is so bad that even the rats have turned vegetarian. You'll be doing them a favor by eating it." The absurdity of his comment struck a chord within her. For a fleeting moment, the weight of the world fell away. She felt a laugh bubble up, the sound foreign and strange, yet liberating. "Is that a challenge?" she replied, her voice tinged with surprise at her own boldness. James chuckled, a warm, infectious sound that echoed in the chilly air. "If you eat it, I'll eat it too, just to show solidarity." And in that instant, something shifted. Annalise laughed, a sound that felt like it had been trapped inside her for years. It was a laugh that came from the depths of her being, unguarded and free. She couldn't help it. It was as if the absurdity of the situation had unlocked a part of her that had been buried under layers of fear and hatred. But as quickly as the laughter came, it faded, leaving behind a haunting silence. She looked at James, her heart pounding not with fear, but with an unsettling mixture of hope and confusion. "Why do you care?" James leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Because we are all just people trying to survive this madness. I have seen too much suffering to turn a blind eye." His words struck her like a bolt of lightning. In an instant, the walls she had built around herself began to crumble. This wasn't just a soldier offering her food. It was a human being reaching out, extending a lifeline in a world that felt overwhelmingly dark and hostile. Just then, the sound of boots echoed outside, harsh and commanding. The calm of their exchange shattered. Annalise's heart raced as she turned her gaze towards the entrance, dread pooling in her stomach. The guards were nearing, their faces set in grim lines, ready to enforce the rules that dictated her existence. "Stay quiet," James instructed, his voice urgent as he straightened up, masking their earlier exchange. Annalise's heart sank as she realized the precariousness of their moment. She clutched the tin canister tightly, her mind racing with the implications of what had just transpired. What if they discovered her laughter? What if they saw her humanity? Would it put both their lives in jeopardy? The guards entered, their presence heavy and suffocating. Annalise's breath quickened as she fought the urge to panic. She could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken threat that hung between them. "What's going on here?" one of the guards barked, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the room. Annalisa held her breath, desperate to remain unseen, to protect the fragile connection that had sparked between her and James. "Just checking on the ladies, sir," James replied, his tone steady, but Annalisa could see the flicker of fear in his eyes. "Keep it brief," the guard snapped, dismissing them with a wave of his hand. "We don't have time for your games." As the guards moved on, Annalise exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment crashing down on her. The laughter, the fleeting connection, they felt so fragile now, as if they could shatter at any moment. James's gaze met hers, and in that shared silence a new understanding blossomed. They were not enemies, but two souls navigating the wreckage of war, each carrying their own burdens. But then, as if the universe conspired against them, a chilling thought struck her. What if James was not simply a soldier? What if he was more than just the friendly face in the midst of chaos? The twist of fate lay heavy on her heart as she contemplated the truth. She had seen the papers, the announcements of soldiers missing in action, and the faces of those who had fallen. What if this soldier before her was connected to those stories? What if he had lost someone to this very war? Overwhelmed by the implications, Annalisa felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She had begun to see him as a friend, yet the reality of his existence loomed like a dark shadow. Could she allow herself to feel compassion for someone whose country had wrought such destruction upon her own? The dissonance twisted her stomach, a gnawing reminder that the lines between ally and enemy were far too blurred. In that moment, she understood the complexity of humanity, the tangled web of emotions that war had woven. This soldier, with his kindness and laughter, could be both a lifeline and a reminder of the pain that had haunted her. As she clutched the tin canister to her chest, Annalise realized that she was at a crossroads, standing on the edge of a new understanding. The question remained: could she embrace this humanity that had emerged amidst the chaos, or would she retreat back into the safety of her old beliefs? The answer hung in the air, heavy with unspoken possibilities, as the war outside continued to rage on. In that moment, Annalisa Müller was no longer just a prisoner. She was a witness to the fragile beauty of human connection in the darkest of times. Annalisa sat in the dim light of the barrack, the weight of her experience pressing down on her shoulders. Days had passed since that fateful encounter with Corporal James Bennett, the soldier whose laughter had shattered the walls of her preconceived notions. Each moment since had been a kaleidoscope of emotions, confusion, fear, and an unsettling glimmer of hope. The more she observed him and his fellow soldiers, the more she felt the grip of her past loosening, replaced by a curious yearning for understanding. The barrack was quieter now, the distant sounds of the camp settling into a weary routine. Annalisa could hear the laughter of the British soldiers outside, mingling with the bitter, cold wind. It was a sound she had long associated with the enemy, the oppressor. Yet now, it was different. It felt human and oddly comforting. A few days ago, she would have dismissed the sounds as a reminder of their differences, a stark contrast to the propaganda that had filled her mind. But now the laughter echoed in her heart, challenging her to rethink everything she had learned. She was no longer just a German prisoner. She was a woman caught in a tide of humanity, struggling to reconcile her past with the present. With determination, she rose from her seat, her heart racing as she made her way to the tent entrance. The cold air hit her face like a slap, but the chill was invigorating. As she stepped outside, she was hit by a flurry of snowflakes dancing in the air, and she squinted through the haze to see James standing a few meters away, sharing a moment with another soldier. Their laughter rang out, a melody of camaraderie that tugged at her heartstrings. "Hey there," James called out, spotting her. The warmth in his voice wrapped around her like a blanket. "You look like you could use some fresh air. Care to join us?" Annalisa hesitated, her instincts battling with her desire to connect. She could feel the eyes of other soldiers upon her, but she took a deep breath. "Yes," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper, yet resolute. As she approached, she was acutely aware of the uncertainty that lingered in the air. But as she drew closer, James stepped forward, a friendly smile illuminating his features. "We were just discussing how terrible the food is here," he said, a playful glint in his eyes. "I think I'd rather eat my own boot than another serving of that slop." Annalise couldn't suppress the smile that tugged at her lips, the tension in her shoulders easing. "I think I would agree with you," she managed to say, her voice steadier now. James's laughter was infectious, and the other soldiers joined in, their camaraderie wrapping around her like a warm embrace. In that moment, she felt a flicker of belonging amidst the chaos of war. The barriers she had built around her heart began to crumble, as she engaged in light-hearted banter with them. They shared stories, and she could see that they were not simply soldiers. They were brothers, husbands, and fathers, human beings who, like her, yearned for connection in a world torn apart by conflict. Days turned into weeks, and Annalise's transformation was undeniable. She found herself looking forward to her interactions with James and the others. Their kindness was a balm to her spirit, a stark contrast to the harsh reality of her existence. She began to help the soldiers, offering simple gestures of friendship, sharing scraps of her meager rations, or helping with small tasks around the camp. In one particularly poignant moment, as she and James sat together during a rare moment of respite, he shared a photograph of his family. "This is my sister," he said, handing it over with a smile. "I miss her terribly. She has a knack for making the best pies." Annalise studied the photograph, the warmth radiating from the image of his sister juxtaposed with the coldness of their surroundings. "She looks happy," Annalise replied, her heart swelling with a blend of sadness and longing. "She is," James replied, his expression softening. "And I want nothing more than to return to her, just like I'm sure you want to be with your family." The words hung between them, heavy with understanding. In that moment, the concept of enemy faded away, replaced by a shared humanity that transcended borders and ideologies. Annalisa felt the powerful pull of empathy surge within her, the realization that behind every uniform was a story, a life filled with love and loss. As the war continued to wane, the camp began to change. There were talks of peace, of returning home, and Annalise could feel the flickers of hope ignite within her. Yet with the promise of freedom came the bitter taste of uncertainty. What would happen when she left? Would she go back to the beliefs she had held so tightly? Would she forget the laughter, the kindness, and the moments that had transformed her? On the day that her release was announced, she stood outside the barrack, glancing around at the familiar faces that had become a part of her life. James approached her, his expression a mix of joy and sadness. "Are you going home?" he said, his voice steady but his eyes betraying the weight of the moment. "Yes," she replied, her heart heavy with the knowledge that leaving meant saying goodbye to the people who had opened her eyes to the world beyond the propaganda. I don't know what to do with all of this. Just remember," he said, reaching for her hand, "you've seen the truth. Carry it with you, and know that we are all more alike than we are different." Tears welled in her eyes and she nodded, the gravity of his words sinking deep into her heart. "I will," she promised, the sincerity of her vow echoing in the cold air. As she turned to leave, the weight of her past still lingered, but it was no longer a burden. It was a reminder of how far she had come. Each step she took away from the camp felt lighter, filled with the knowledge that humanity could prevail even in the darkest of times. Years later, as she reflected on those days, Annalise knew that the war had not just changed her life. It had transformed her understanding of what it meant to be human. The laughter of a soldier, a shared moment of vulnerability, and the bonds formed in adversity had opened her heart to the world. She had learned that love, kindness, and understanding were the true weapons against hatred and division. And with that, she resolved to share her story, to remind others that behind every uniform and every conflict, there lies a shared humanity. She would carry James's words with her always, a beacon of hope in a world often overshadowed by darkness. If you believe, like Annalise, that stories of humanity can bridge divides and foster understanding, join our community of history lovers. Subscribe to our channel and help us continue to bring these vital stories out of the shadows. Let's remember that empathy is the most powerful weapon we have against hatred. Thank you for watching, and may we all strive to see the humanity in one another.